Chapter 1, Food Safety Plan. Overview for Preventive Controls for Human Food. Presented by David Rosson. A food safety plan is the primary document which guides the preventive controls food safety system. A food safety plan, as required in the Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation, is developed using a systematic approach to identify and evaluate those hazards that require preventive controls, and then to establish preventive controls for those hazards to prevent foodborne illness or injury. This chapter provides a brief discussion of the systematic approach involved in building a food safety plan, which is consistent with the well-established food safety principles of hazard analysis and critical control points, HACCP. This chapter also provides an overview of the components of a food safety plan needed to comply with the Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation, including the responsibilities of a preventive controls qualified individual. Additionally, this overview will help visualize how to structure a food safety plan specific to the operation. Each component is covered in more detail later in the course. By the end of this chapter, participants will be able to describe the concept of preventive controls, explain the difference between hazard analysis and critical control points, HACCP, and preventive controls, explain the benefits of developing and implementing a food safety plan, describe the elements both required and recommended in building a food safety plan, identify the responsibilities of a preventive controls qualified individual, PCQI. A proactive and systematic science-based approach to food safety, emphasizing the preventive controls approach, has been universally accepted and adopted throughout the world because it helps to focus attention on the most important areas to prevent food safety issues rather than reacting to problems as they arise. The goal of a food safety plan is to prevent hazards in food. This is accomplished through a risk-based approach. This scientifically based approach is methodical and systematic in that it evaluates the inputs, including raw materials and other ingredients, and process steps to identify potential hazards, determine the risk of those hazards, and establish controls to significantly minimize or eliminate that risk. Preventive control programs are structured to work in conjunction with and be supported by other relevant programs, such as good manufacturing practices, GMPs, good agricultural practices, GAPs, and sanitary transportation practices as the basis for food safety management. Successful application of preventive controls approaches, as established within the Preventive Controls for Human Foods Regulation, helps minimizes the risk of producing products that can harm consumers. Risk-based approaches to managing food safety were pioneered during development of food for the U.S. space program in the 1960s. At that time, end product testing was the focus of quality control programs. It became evident that the end product testing necessary to provide assurance that food was safe would be so extensive that little food would be available for space flights. The focus shifted to preventing hazards through product formulation and process control in a risk-based manner. The concept was called hazard analysis and critical control point, HACCP. Before HACCP-based systems were mandated by regulation, and HACCP programs evolved over time. Starting in the 1990s, the U.S. National Advisory Committee on Microbiological Criteria for Foods and the Codex Alimentarius Commission, Codex, published guidelines for the application of HACCP principles. In the mid-1990s, USDA issued regulations requiring HACCP for the production of meat and poultry, and FDA issued requirements for HACCP for the seafood industry. In the early 2000s, FDA issued HACCP regulations for juice products in response to outbreaks of foodborne illness linked to apple juice. In 1999, the National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments initiated a voluntary dairy HACCP pilot program for grade A dairy plants to test the concept that a HACCP program could function as an equal alternative to the long-used numerical ratings to measure a plant's compliance. Details from the grade A dairy HACCP pilot program was added to the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance in an appendix in 2015. And in 2020, USDA published regulations for egg products regulated by USDA. HACCP principles are endorsed by many countries, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the European Union countries. From the early development of HACCP, 7 principles, listed above, were used to apply HACCP to food processes. These principles include conducting the hazard analysis, determining the critical control point, CCP, establishing critical limits, establishing monitoring procedures, establishing corrective actions, establishing verification procedures, and establishing record keeping and documentation. A quick review of these principles is useful to understand how the preventive controls for human food regulation builds on the risk-based HACCP approach. In a HACCP system, a hazard analysis identifies ingredient, raw, material-related, and process-related hazards that, in the absence of a control, present a food safety risk. For those identified hazards, critical control points, CCPs, are established, which are essential to prevent the hazard from causing illness or injury. For each CCP, critical limits are determined to ensure the operating conditions in the process are met so as to effectively control the identified hazard. Monitoring of the CCPs demonstrates that critical limits are met and provides documentation of process compliance. Corrective actions are taken in response to when a critical limit is not met, referred to as a deviation, and enables swift action preventing expansion of a food safety issue. All monitoring and corrective actions are recorded and verified to ensure the system is operating and as intended. Records also provide data to others, such as inspectors, auditors, and management staff, to show that the system is operating as intended. More information on each of these principles is discussed in this course, where appropriate, recognizing that a HACCP plan essentially addresses most of the requirements for process preventive controls. The National Advisory Committee on Microbiological Criteria for Foods reconvened a HACCP working group in 1995. That committee identified the 5 preliminary tasks that need to be accomplished before application of the 7 HACCP principles to a specific product and process. These steps are: 1. Assemble a HACCP team. 2. Describe the food and its distribution. 3. Describe the intended use and consumers of the food. 4. Develop a flow diagram which describes the process. And 5. Verify the flow diagram. These preliminary steps and the 7 principles, termed the 12 steps of HACCP, were employed for development of HACCP plans to meet the stated food safety goals. HACCP focuses on preventing hazards related to the process by establishing CCPs at relevant points in the process. The preventive controls for human food regulation takes a broader preventive focus, identifying potential risks and implementing appropriate controls to proactively address food safety hazards associated with allergens and sanitation, as well as those under the control of the ingredient raw material supplier. Allergen controls focus on preventing cross-contact, unintended allergen presence, and mislabeling undeclared allergens. Sanitation controls may be used to clean processing equipment food contact surfaces to control pathogen cross-contamination and food allergen cross-contact, and to clean the facility's processing environment to prevent recontamination from environmental pathogens in ready-to-eat foods exposed to the environment before packaging. Supply chain controls are aimed at ingredients, raw materials that may pose hazards in a product where the supplier is controlling those hazards. This slide provides a few examples of outbreaks and recalls that occurred when preventive controls were lacking. Undeclared allergen reports have steadily increased since the inception of the FDA's Reportable Food Registry, RFR. In the first year, 30% of RFR reports were related to allergens, and that has risen to 50% of reports more recently. The bakery commodity group accounted for the most allergen mislabeling reports. Failures in sanitation have resulted in outbreaks. Listeria monocytogenes, contamination in brie and camembert cheese was linked to 6 illnesses that resulted in 5 hospitalizations and a multi-state outbreak in 2022. 21 illness cases of Salmonella Simpfenberg, were linked to ready-to-eat peanut butter in 2022. In both cases, the outbreak strains were found in the facility through environmental sampling. Illnesses also have been linked to supplied ingredients. In 2021, 31 Salmonella illnesses were linked to multiple types of salad products that contained contaminated leafy greens. Learning from past outbreaks and recalls can help protect consumers and businesses from similar unfortunate incidents. The U.S. Congress passed the Food Safety Modernization Act, a law that amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which the President signed in 2011. Food Safety Modernization Act builds on the Food Safety Foundation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and places more emphasis on preventing food safety hazards. The Food Safety Modernization Act law required FDA to write 9 regulations, shown above, along with numerous guidance documents. The scope of this course is the preventive controls for human foods regulation. Some of these other regulations may have an impact on a facility's food safety plan, which will be discussed in subsequent chapters. On September 17, 2015, the final regulations on current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food were issued by the FDA to meet the Food Safety Modernization Act law and are published in 21 CFR Part 117. The regulation focuses on a preventive approach to food safety and establishes new requirements for a food safety plan, including hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, as mandated by FSMA, and modernizes long-standing current good manufacturing practices. These requirements include comprehensive hazard analysis, identified preventive controls, e.g. process, allergen, sanitation, and supply chain, for each hazard requiring a preventive control. Management components for each preventive control to include monitoring, corrective actions, verification, a recall plan, and record keeping. These activities and their implementation must be performed or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual as required by the regulation. Traditional HACCP focuses on the process control specific to a food type, identifying hazards at each step that need control within the process itself and defining the parameters for their management. A generic example is shown on the slide associated with a hazard from a possibly pathogen contaminated ingredient that is controlled with the cook CCP. The cooking critical limit is 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds. This is monitored by measuring the time and temperature at cooking and a corrective action of recooking is taken if the critical limit is not met. Records of these activities are kept on the cook log. Verification includes calibration of the temperature monitoring instrument. Under the preventive controls for human food regulation, hazards are identified through the hazard analysis process, and for those hazards determined to require a preventive control, i.e., are significant, based on severity and likelihood of occurrence, a preventive control is required. As mentioned, the preventive controls include controls beyond the process-related CCPs identified in the HACCP framework, including food allergen controls, sanitation controls, and supply chain controls. There are other differences beyond these additional preventive controls. The preventive controls approach recognizes that critical limits may not be required for some preventive controls. Critical limits are defined as a maximum and/or minimum value to which a biological, chemical, or physical parameter must be controlled at a CCP to prevent, eliminate, or reduce to an acceptable level the occurrence of a food safety hazard. Rather, the broader term, parameters and values, supports identification of a frequency or other metric to assess control, rather than setting a precise minimum or maximum value to which a parameter must be controlled. Another difference is related to handling certain out-of-control situations at a preventive control where a product is not at risk. In these cases, the regulation allows for corrections, those immediate actions, such as re-cleaning a line before startup, that can be taken without the formality of a corrective action because no product was produced on the equipment. So, while the food safety plan is HACCP-based, there are differences from HACCP that are important to understand. Elements of a food safety plan that differ from HACCP include broader considerations of hazard types, including radiological hazards as a subset of chemical hazards, and where economically motivated hazards could pose a risk. Preventive controls include additional controls to those that are process-related, monitoring of the implementation of other preventive controls, in addition to CCPs. Corrective actions taken for other preventive controls, in addition to CCPs. Addition of corrections to recognize that some preventive controls may not require all of the required elements for corrective actions, e.g. sanitation. Failures can sometimes be corrected by re-cleaning before production begins, without holding product because no product was produced on the equipment. Verification is required for all preventive controls and includes supplier verification when a supplier controls the identified hazard. Validation is a verification activity and required for process controls as appropriate to the nature of the process control. Records are required when preventive controls are identified, including controls that are not process controls. A recall plan is a required part of the food safety plan when a hazard requiring a preventive control is identified. The food safety plan is the primary element of a company's food safety system. The food safety plan is the hazard analysis, along with appropriate preventive controls and its management components needed for each identified hazard. The food safety system is the overall food safety efforts of a company that include the food safety plan and supporting elements which include GMPs and prerequisite programs. Be sure to check out the definitions and read them aloud. The food safety plan is a dynamic document which must be kept current if changes are made to the system or to equipment, when new products and/or ingredients are added, or new hazards are identified. The diagram above shows that the food safety plan includes several elements, including the hazard analysis and the preventive controls, along with a recall plan, many GMPs, and other prerequisite programs support but are not included in the food safety plan, although they are important parts of the food safety system. However, as can be seen in the diagram above, there are elements of the prerequisite programs that can become part of the food safety plan. GMPs are required because they form the foundation for the food safety plan. Developing a food safety plan helps to focus most of the activities on what matters most for food safety. The required elements of a food safety plan include the hazard analysis and any preventive controls, with management components that were determined as needed to control identified significant hazards. A recall plan also is required when the hazard analysis has identified hazards requiring a preventive control. Other elements such as facility overview, food safety team, product description, flow diagram, and process description are not required by the regulation, but are recommended because they are useful in developing the food safety plan. For the facility, it is helpful to have a designated food safety team and have a written facility overview. For each food safety plan, it is recommended that there is a written product description, a flow diagram, and a process description, which are very helpful when conducting the hazard analysis. These elements will be discussed further in Chapter 5. Food safety plans are specific to a facility and specific to a food process or product type. It is possible to group products under one food safety plan, provided that the process is similar with the same hazards and controls. This includes differences in formulation, including allergens or packaging types, provided it is clearly identified in the food safety plan. Some facilities may decide to organize food safety plans by unit operations and production, e.g., making a blend that is used in several products to reduce overlap or avoid inconsistency. The organization of the food safety plan is decided by the food safety team. Considerations for the scope of the food safety plan determine the specific products and processes that the food safety plan will address. Define the part of the food chain to be considered, e.g., products sold to retail may have different considerations than those sold to food service, to manufacturers, or directly to the consumer, and address biological, chemical, including radiological, and physical hazards associated with the above. The specific format of a food safety plan is not defined in the regulation. The facility food safety team can organize the required information in a manner that fits the systems, the needs of employees, the needs of customers, and the requirements of the regulation. A food safety plan should be easy to understand, implement, and manage, kept up to date, and organized and accessible for regulatory inspection. The following is an example of how a food safety plan might be organized using a binder example. Note that there is no requirement that all components of a food safety plan even be in a binder. This is just an example. This course is organized around building a food safety plan. In this example, there are 4 main sections or tabs for the food safety plan, including recommended background information and the required hazard analysis, preventive controls, recall plan, and implementation records. Each main section's components are reviewed in more detail in subsequent chapters of this course. The information behind the Background Information tab is covered in Chapter 5, Preliminary Steps in Developing a Food Safety Plan. Background information is not required by regulations, but provides a framework for organizing the food safety plan, for conducting the hazard analysis, and for explaining the plan to others. Remember, anything included as part of the plan may be subject to regulatory access and review. A brief description of the facility or company may be included. Listing members of the food safety team, along with any training, could be included in this section. The product description section identifies important characteristics of the product, including ingredients and packaging used that may impact food safety. An accurate flow diagram is recommended to ensure that all steps of the process are evaluated to identify food safety hazards, and it serves as a useful organization format for the required written food safety plan. Finally, the process description can provide information needed to fully understand how the product is made, which is helpful for understanding the types of preventive controls applied. A facility can use other documents to meet these goals if that works for the operation. The hazard analysis drives decision-making on which hazards require a preventive control. Thus, the hazard analysis forms the basis for other required elements in the food safety plan. Careful analysis of the hazards that may be relevant for the food product and the process will help to focus the controls on what matters most. More information will be reviewed in Chapter 6, Hazard Analysis, and Chapter 7, Preventive Controls Determination. The Preventive Controls section describes the essential controls that ensure a safe food product is produced. The required preventive controls for a specific food product are determined through the hazard analysis process, which considers the nature of the preventive control and its role in the facility's food safety system. Process preventive controls are discussed in Chapters 8 through 10. Food allergen preventive controls are covered in Chapter 11, and sanitation preventive controls are discussed in Chapter 12. Supply chain preventive controls include supplier approval and verification activities for ingredients and raw materials that have hazards for which the control is applied by the supplier. These ingredients are identified through hazard analysis. Chapter 13, Supply Chain Program, discusses supplier-related activities. In some cases, there may be other controls used by a facility as part of their food safety system, such as transportation controls, which would also be included here. A recall plan is also required in the preventive controls for human food regulation. When in the hazard analysis, a hazard requiring a preventive control is identified, recall plans will be discussed in Chapter 15. A preventive controls qualified individual is required by the preventive controls for human food regulation. This person is a qualified individual who has successfully completed training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls, at least equivalent to that received under a standardized curriculum recognized as adequate by the FDA. This course, developed by FSPCA, is the standardized curriculum recognized by FDA. Successfully completing this course is one way to meet the requirements for a preventive controls qualified individual. It is not required that the preventive controls qualified individual take this course. However, since the regulation also states that a preventive controls qualified individual can be otherwise qualified through job experience to develop and apply a food safety system. Job experience may qualify an individual to perform preventive controls qualified individual functions if such experience has provided the individual with knowledge at least equivalent to that provided through the standardized curriculum. If qualified by training, the preventive controls qualified individual's training must be documented in training records, including the name of the person trained, the type of training, and the date of the training. The preventive controls qualified individual may be an employee of the facility, but can also be an individual secured through other mechanisms, such as a consulting contract or a company corporate food safety expert to lead the development of the plan. In some situations, more than one preventive controls qualified individual may be needed to effectively develop and implement a food safety plan. More detail on the different parts of the food safety plan is provided within the course. Under the regulation, certain tasks must be performed or overseen by the preventive controls qualified individual. These include 1. Preparation of the food safety plan. 2. Validation of the preventive controls, including justification for validation, time frame exceeding 90 days, and determination that validation is not required. 3. Records review, including justification for review of monitoring and corrective action records, time frame exceeding 7 working days. And 4. Reanalysis of the food safety plan, including determination that the time frame for reanalysis and additional preventive controls validation can exceed the first 90 days of production of the applicable food. The term oversee infers that a preventive controls qualified individual will watch over and direct an activity, a group of workers, etc., in order to ensure a satisfactory outcome or performance of assigned activities. This could involve ensuring that individuals have had the proper training to perform assigned activities. The 21 Code of Federal Regulations, 117.3 definitions for preventive controls qualified individual, as well as the 21 Code of Federal Regulations, 117.180 requirements applicable to a preventive controls qualified individual, are available in Appendix 1. In summary, the Food Safety Plan is a written document specific to the facility. It must contain a written hazard analysis and separate plans or programs that address process preventive controls, allergen preventive controls, sanitation preventive controls, supply, chain programs, and other preventive controls determined to be necessary by the hazard analysis. When hazards requiring a preventive control are identified, written programs that include procedures, monitoring, corrective action, verification, and implementation records must be included. The food safety plan also must contain a recall plan for food where a hazard requiring a preventive control has been identified. There is no required format for these documents or for the food safety plan itself. Some facilities may combine different food safety plan sections, while some may separate sections. There is no requirement that all parts of the food safety plan be in one location. The important point is that the whole food safety plan is organized in a way that identifies hazards requiring a preventive control, so that 1. The hazards are effectively managed, and 2. The facility has records that demonstrate these preventive controls are in place and being consistently implemented. The plan documents should be organized and easily retrievable when needed, e.g., for inspections or audits. Each of the elements of a food safety plan is discussed in subsequent chapters using examples from a hypothetical food operation. By successfully completing this course participants will meet the training requirements for a preventive controls qualified individual who can oversee a food safety preventive controls program. Participants may need assistance from technical experts or resources to develop certain elements of a food safety program. Additional resources will be discussed in chapters later in the course. The remainder of this course will teach participants how to develop a risk-based food safety plan and implement preventive controls to help mitigate and control hazards specific to a food product and process. Preventive controls reduce potential food safety issues for the public and for businesses as well. The definitions used in this course are in Appendix 8 of the participant manual. Participation is vital for understanding the material. Shared experiences and questions can help all participants in the course as well. So Participation is highly encouraged. You have completed the lecture for Chapter 1. Be sure to complete the knowledge check as well as the Chapter 1 exercise. See you in Chapter 2.